The valley below had a name once, but the man on the ridge had stopped using names for the places he meant to fill with the dead. He lay in a hollow he had scraped out over 3 cold nights, his rifle wrapped in burlap the exact gray-brown of the scree, and he watched the road the way a patient man watches a snare. Down there, a supply truck had stalled with its hood up and one wheel in the ditch, and the men crouched around it were not mechanics. They were bait, and they knew it, and that knowledge sat on them like a wet coat. The marksman the mountain people called Rosh felt none of that. He had killed 19 of the coalition's people in this range of hills, and he had learned that the trick of it was not marksmanship at all. It was appetite. You set out something the rescuers could not leave alone, and then you waited for their better feelings to walk them into the open. He checked the light. He checked the wind off the snowfields which came down the couloirs in the late morning like water finding a drain. He settled his cheek against the stock and let his breathing slow, and somewhere behind him, 40 kilometers back, a helicopter he had not planned for was already lifting off a gravel pad, carrying the one variable he had not accounted for. She did not look like much, and the men waiting for her at the forward base had decided that before the rotors even stopped. Her name was Frayne. Sergeant Juno Frayne, 29 years old, 5'5" in her boots. And when she stepped down off the skid onto the frozen apron, she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned early that being watched was the ordinary condition of her life and had stopped letting it hurry her. She carried a long, hard case in both hands, cradled against her body the way you carry something you built, and the wind coming off the ridges lifted the loose strands of her hair, and she did not reach up to fix them. She just walked, head level, toward the ops shack, and the 6 men standing in the lee of the fuel bladders watched her come. It was Pike who spoke first, and Pike who would later be the most ashamed of it. He was the team's designated marksman, 15 years in, a lean man with a face like a closed fist, and he had earned the right to be arrogant about exactly one thing in this world and knew it. "Tell me that's not our overwatch," he said. He said it loud enough to carry. "Tell me battalion did not put a girl who looks like she's home from her first year of college on a ridgeline to keep me breathing." A couple of the others laughed, the low, reflexive laugh of men who are cold and frightened and grateful for anything to push against. Frayne gave no sign that she had heard. The narrator of a life like hers would note that this was not composure in the ordinary sense. It was older than that. It was the specific stillness of a person who has decided that other people's opinions of her are weather, real, sometimes severe, but not something you argue with. The team's senior man, Master Sergeant Halloran, met her at the door. He was 51 and looked it, a big, slow-seeming man whose slowness was a kind of camouflage. He had buried more people than he cared to count and had developed as a result a deep suspicion of anything that looked too good or too small or too new. He had read Frayne's file on the flight in 3 times and it had not settled him. Distinguished scores. A pile of range records that read like typos. 6 years in and almost no combat time because she'd spent most of it being loaned out to schools as an instructor, which was the Army's way of admiring something without knowing what to do with it. "Surgeon," he said. "Master Sergeant." She set the case down, offered her hand. Her grip was dry and unhurried. "You heard Pike. I heard him. He's not wrong to worry. This isn't a range." Halloran said it flatly, the way you'd tell someone the stove was hot, not to insult them but because burns were real. "We've got a man down in that valley. A contractor named OC's crew got separated from. Hydrologist. Of all things, out here to map the aquifers, and now he's holed up in a stone byre with a militia closing on him and about 6 hours of daylight left. The approach is bad. 3 ridge lines, a lot of dead ground, and a shooter working these hills who has put 19 of ours in the dirt and never once let us see him do it. So when the men look at you and see somebody who could be their kid's sister, understand that's not really what they're seeing. They're seeing everybody we couldn't bring home." Frayne considered this longer than most people would have. "That's fair," she said finally. "I'd rather they doubt me than trust me for the wrong reasons. Doubt I can work with." She picked the case back up. "Where do you want me to prove it?" Halloran almost smiled. He didn't, but it was a near thing. He took her out to the improvised range behind the motor pool, and by then word had gone around, and most of the team drifted over with the studied casualness of men who absolutely intend to watch a show. The wind was worse there, funneled between 2 hills and gusting hard, the kind of conditions a sane instructor canceled a range for. Frayne unrolled a mat, laid her rifle out, and assembled it with a slowness that Pike, watching, first read as timidity and then gradually stopped reading that way. There was nothing timid in it. It was the movement of someone for whom each component had a correct place and a correct feel, and who would not be rushed past either. The rifle itself was unusual. A bolt gun she had clearly reworked herself. The barrel a match tube, the stock bedded and shaped to her. The whole thing scuffed and cared for in the way of a tool that has been somewhere. Steel plates at 1,100 meters, Halloran said. We don't have anything further set up. That's fine to start. She settled behind it, and the change in her was total and quiet. Later, several of the men would try to describe it, and none of them would quite manage. It was as if a light in a room had been turned off, so you could see something outside the window. She lay still for a long moment, watching the grass and the dust and the shimmer, reading a language the rest of them didn't have. Then the rifle spoke, one flat crack that the wind tore away, and 1,100 meters downrange the plate rang. Again, Halloran said. She worked the bolt, fired, rang it. There's a gust off the left every 40 seconds or so, she said. Not to show off, just narrating. It pushes about a foot at this range. You have to shoot in the lull or hold for it. She fired a third time, in the lull. Dead center, and Pike, who had come to stand almost over her, went very quiet. Push it out, he said. Far as you've got a plate. Then further. They dragged a smaller plate out to what the range NCO swore was 1,500 meters, a distance at which it vanished from the naked eye into the gray of the hillside. Frayne dialed her scope, took her time, and put a round through it. The clang came back thin and delayed, a small, bright sound from a long way off. 1,500, in this wind. First round, Halloran said, mostly to himself. He looked at Pike. Pike's face had gone through disdain into a careful professional neutrality, which on a man like Pike was the equivalent of open astonishment. What's your longest confirmed? Pike asked her. Real distance, not a range. Frayne cleared the bolt, sat up, and looked at him without heat. 1,840, she said, 2 winters ago. A wounded elk, my grandmother couldn't finish herself anymore. Her hands were gone by then, arthritis, and she wouldn't let it suffer down a coulee overnight because a person too proud to make a hard shot has no business owning a rifle. That's not a man shooting back. I know the difference. But the arithmetic doesn't care whether you're afraid. The wind does what it does, whether your heart's going or not. You learn to be the still part. It should have landed as bravado. It didn't, because she said it the way you'd report the temperature. They inserted that evening, under a sky the color of a bruise, the light going fast the way it does in the mountains. Halloran took his element on foot toward the valley. Frayne split off with Ostrander, the team's breacher, to climb to the overwatch spur that would give her eyes on the whole approach. The two of them went up through broken rock and old snow, and Ostrander, who had said nothing unkind to her, and nothing kind either, adjusted the straps of her pack without being asked when he saw them riding wrong. And she thanked him, and that was the whole of it, and it meant more than either of them said. By full dark she was in position, prone in a nest of stone, with the valley spread below her in the green wash of the night scope, and her voice came over the net, barely louder than the wind. Overwatch, set, eyes on the buyer, eyes on the approach, no movement. For an hour there was nothing but the cold and the patient work of watching. Then, 40 minutes into Halloran's advance, when his element was moving up a dry watercourse that offered cover but also blinded them, Frayne keyed her radio, and there was a new edge under the calm. Halloran, hold. The wind's wrong. On the net, Pike's voice, tight with the strain of the approach. The wind's wrong. That's the call. We're stopping the war because the breeze offended her. Halloran ignored him. Overwatch, say again. The snowmelt air comes down these draws on a schedule. I've been reading it 2 hours, down the main couloir, then it spills and fans. There's a spot about 400 meters north of the buyer where it's breaking early and hooking, like it's hitting something it shouldn't. There's nothing on the map there. There's nothing on the ground that should do that. A pause, the smallest hitch of breath. Something's dug in. The air's flowing over a thing that's been made to look like ground. I'd bet it's a firing position, and it's sighted to catch you exactly where your watercourse pops out into the open. Halloran looked at the map on his wrist. He looked at the black slope, where she said the trouble was. There was, to his eyes and to the 2-day-old imagery, nothing at all. The truth of what happened next is that he had no rational basis for what he did. He had a rookie's voice in his ear, describing wind, contradicting his intelligence and his eyes. But there is a thing that men who have survived a long time develop, a sense not for facts but for the shape of certainty in another person, and what he heard in Frayne was not a guess dressed as a fact. It was a fact she happened to be able to see. All elements, he said. We're breaking off the watercourse. Wide left. Slow. Overwatch. Keep that position lit up. Anything moves, you tell me before it finishes the thought. They swung wide, and it cost them 40 minutes of hard, careful movement, and the whole time, Pike's silence on the net had a texture to it. Then, when they were most of the way around Frayne again, movement, your bad spot. 3 shapes coming up out of the ground. They've got a launcher. They're set to fire down the draw you'd have come out of. Another beat. You'd have walked out right under them. Ice, in the men who heard it. If they had held their line, they'd have come into the open 40 meters under an RPG team at leisure. Can you take them? Halloran breathed. They're in defilade from me, no shot, but they don't know you've moved. You've got their flank. What followed was quick and quiet and terrible in the ordinary way of such things. Halloran took 2 men around and up, and on his word 3 rifles fired almost together, and the launcher crew folded into the dark without a sound. And when the team went in to clear the position, they found it was not one crew, but a whole prepared killing. Sighted lanes, a cache of rockets, a second and third fighting hole scraped out and roofed with matting and rock, the entire mouth of the valley engineered into a trap by someone who had known they would come. Halloran stood in the middle of it with his heart going and keyed the net. Overwatch, he said. You just kept this whole team alive. How in God's name did you see that? The wind doesn't lie, Frayne said. People do. Ground doesn't. But wind just tells you what's under it if you'll shut up long enough to listen. There was a silence on the net and then Pike's voice, and it had lost all its edges. Frayne, Pike. I was out of line back at the pad. I've never seen anybody make that call. Not once in 15 years. And then, because he was who he was, where'd you learn to read air like that? Later, she said, you've still got a man and a buyer and a night to get him out of. They got the hydrologist out an hour before dawn, a shaking, grateful, useless man who wept and thanked Halloran and never once understood that he owed his life to a woman he would never meet, on a ridge 3 kilometers away who read the sky. And on the flight back, in the shuddering dark of the cabin, the men who had laughed at the pad were quiet, and the quiet was a different kind now. It is a curious thing, the narrator might observe, how quickly contempt converts to something like reverence, and how little either has to do with the person it lands on. Frayne sat with her case between her knees and her head against the airframe, eyes closed, and let it all wash past her because she had learned the second hardest lesson of her trap line before she'd learned to drive, that being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and that a person who cannot tell them apart will let the first one hollow her out while she waits for the second. The debrief was worse than the mission in the way debriefs always are. A lieutenant colonel named Bianchi ran it, a compact woman with gray at her temples and a manner that gave nothing away. And beside her sat a civilian named Sutton in a jacket that had no business at a forward base. And Sutton did most of the talking, and none of it was comfortable. You put 11 confirmed on the board last night and unraveled the most sophisticated ambush network we've cataloged in this sector, Bianchi said, reading from a tablet. By reading the wind. Yes, ma'am. That's not in any doctrine I know. No, ma'am. It's not doctrine. It's my grandmother. Frayne said it without embarrassment. She ran a trap line north of the Rockies for 40 years and read weather the way other people read a clock. She used to say most folks go through the whole world half blind because they've already decided what they're looking at. She taught me to undecide, to just see the thing that's actually there. Sometimes the thing that's there is buried men. Sutton leaned in. That marksman working these hills. Rash, our people call him, former special forces, foreign, been freelancing here about a year, 19 of ours before last night. He built that trap, which means he was there, running it, and you took it apart under his nose. Sutton let that sit. Men like Rash, Sergeant, they don't file that under bad luck. He's going to want to know who cost him 19 months of patience. And when he finds out it was a woman he'd have written off, no offense, he's going to take it personally. You've made yourself a name to him. That's a dangerous thing to be. So we cover her, Halloran said. His voice had an edge Frayne hadn't heard. Keep her on the ridge. Screen her movements. Don't let him get an angle. That's one option, Sutton agreed, and the temperature of the room dropped. The other is that we let him come. We have finally got something Rash wants badly enough to break his own rules for. A patient man with an appetite is only patient until you show him the right thing on the road. And there it was, the old ugly arithmetic. Set out the bait, wait for the better feelings, or in this case the worse ones, to walk the target into the open. Halloran was on his feet before he'd decided to be. You're not staking her out. I'm proposing we end a man who has killed 19 of ours and will kill more, Sutton said, unmoved. With her cooperation, which I notice we haven't asked for. They all looked at Frayne. She had gone very still, the still part of herself, and behind her eyes the arithmetic was running, not the fear, though the fear was there, but the odds, the angles, the shape of it. When she spoke, it was quiet. If leaving me out there gets a man like that off the board, she said, then that's the job. I didn't come here to be kept in a box. She looked at Halloran, and something passed between them, gratitude and grief and refusal all at once. But I do it my way. He'll expect me to sit where a sniper sits. I won't, and I want Pike. Pike at the back straightened. You've got Pike, he said. They ran it 3 days later, and the 3 days were the worst kind, all preparation and imagination. Frayne did not spend them practicing long shots. Halloran noticed and understood. She was drilling the fast, ugly close work, snapshots, the kind you needed when a duel collapsed to knife range, because she had reasoned that a man as good as Rosh would either miss her clean or get close enough that distance stopped mattering, and she meant to be ready for the second thing. Pike worked beside her, teaching her what 15 years had taught him about reading heat haze at speed, and somewhere in those 3 days the last of his resentment turned into something almost fatherly, which surprised him more than it surprised her. On the night before, Halloran found her in the arms room, cleaning a rifle that did not need cleaning. He sat down across from her. You scared? He asked. Not of dying. My grandmother took the fear of that out of me when I was 15, and she was dying and unafraid and told me the fear was just interest paid on a debt. Everyone settles anyway. She ran a patch through the bore. I'm scared of missing when it matters. Every shot out here has somebody's whole life folded up inside it now. And there's going to be a day the wind shifts a half second early, or my hands don't do what I tell them, and somebody's life comes unfolded because I wasn't enough. That's the thing I lie awake on, not mine. Theirs. Halloran had carried that same stone for 25 years. You can't hold all of it, he said. You'll go under. I know. She reassembled the bolt, her hands sure. I don't know how not to. The trap for Rosh was sprung on a ridge above a river the men couldn't pronounce. With 2 counter-snipper teams tucked into folds of rock and frames set deliberately wrong, low and forward of where a shooter should be, so that anyone hunting her would have to expose himself to reach her, and it nearly worked the way it was drawn. Near mid-morning, a single figure came off the far slope, moving in the dead ground with a patience that made Pike's skin crawl, and it was Frayne who saw him first, who talked the counter teams onto him meter by meter because she could see the way the light bent round, who had spent a year learning to be invisible. He's setting up, one of the counter teams reported at last. 900 meters off overwatch, positive ID, request permission to fire, and Frayne's voice cut in, sharp, wait, overwatch, we have him. You have someone, she said. It's wrong. A man that careful doesn't take a merely good hide when a perfect one's 50 meters left. He picked one you could see, he wants to be seen. A beat, and Halloran heard her breathing change. He's not looking at me. He's looking north. There's a second shooter. Rash is the bait for his own trap. He set out the thing we couldn't leave alone, and it's himself. Then, very fast, glint, 1,500 meters north-northeast, off a scope. The counter teams can't see him, the ridge is in the way. I'm the only one with the angle. Requesting permission to engage the real one. Bianchi's voice on the command net, overwatch, the counter teams will. They cannot see him, ma'am. Flat. Certain. It's me or it's nobody, and if it's nobody, the next thing that happens is he takes one of your teams and I take him a second too late. The silence lasted a heartbeat that felt like a season. Engage, said Halloran. She had already begun. 1,500 meters, a variable morning wind coming off the river in gusts, a target the size of a dinner plate showing for seconds at a time. Pike lay beside her, calling the wind in a low, steady murmur, and Frayne breathed and waited, and the wind dropped into its lull, and she trusted the arithmetic the way you trust a floor, and fired. A second and a half of nothing, and then 1,500 meters north, the second shooter came off his hide and did not move again. And in the same instant, the counter teams took Rosh, who had exposed himself to watch his own mousetrap close, and had made, for the first time in a year, a fatal assumption about who he was hunting. Both down, someone said on the net. Confirmed. Both down. It should have been triumph, and it was for the men. But when they came off the ridge, Halloran found Pike kneeling beside Frayne, his hand on her shoulder, and Frayne bent over her rifle with her whole body shaking, not from cold. She had held it flawlessly, for as long as flawless mattered, And then, the instant it was over, she had come apart. And Pike had simply stayed, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he had the wisdom to know it. The near thing came a month later, and it was the thing that finally broke her. And it did not involve Rosh or any enemy worth the name. A vehicle carrying a Canadian field nurse named Saraf and 3 local children had been ambushed on a mountain road, the driver killed, and the survivors run to ground in a half-collapsed schoolhouse by a militia band who wanted them for leverage. There was no time for a proper rescue force. There was a ridge at 1,400 meters, and there was Frayne, and there was a boy named Sammy, 8 years old, whom one of the fighters dragged out into the schoolyard by the collar and forced to his knees in the open as a message. "Overwatch," Halloran said, and his own voice was not steady. "Boy in the yard, 1 tango behind him with a pistol. You are cleared." "There are 2 more within reach of him," Frayne said. Her voice was thin as wire. "If any of them so much as flinches when I fire, if one falls the wrong way, they fall on him." "I understand. Take the shot." She did not answer for a moment, and in that moment, the whole architecture of what she was ran its arithmetic. The range, the angle, the wind coming off the schoolyard wall, the exact geometry of a child's kneeling body and the man behind it, and the 1,400 meters of cold air between. Pike beside her held his breath, and then she fired, and the man behind the boy dropped as if the ground had opened, and Sammy screamed and ran, and Halloran's team came out of the rocks under the confusion and did the rest, and it was by every measure anyone could name a perfect shot. Except that it hadn't been quite. When the boy was safe and the schoolhouse cleared, and the nurse Seraph sobbing her thanks into Halloran's shoulder, Frayne sat on the ridge with the rifle across her knees and did not move, and when Pike touched her arm, she flinched as if burned. "The wind hooked at the last quarter second," she said, and her voice was wrong. "I felt it go. The round passed. It passed a hand's width from his head, Pike. A hand's width. She couldn't finish it. I nearly put a bullet through an 8-year-old to save him. That's the arithmetic now. That's what I do. I gamble children on my hands not shaking." "But it held," Pike said. "Your hands held. This time." She turned to him, and what was in her face was not the old stillness. It had cracked all the way through. "There's always a this time, and then there's the other one. And I can't keep waiting for the other one. I can't carry another one. I don't have the room." They brought her back, and she did not eat, and she did not sleep. And Halloran, who had watched better men than either of them go down this exact gray road, did the one thing his pride had always made hardest. He asked for help. He walked into Bianchi's office and said the words he hated, that his best asset was breaking, that she was 19 kinds of essential and 1 kind of human, and that if they used her the way the appetite of the machine wanted to use her, they would grind her to nothing inside a season and then have neither the asset nor the person. Bianchi listened, and to her credit, she did not reach for the easy answer. She brought in a psychologist, a major named Morrison, who specialized in the particular wounds of people whose job was the impossible. And she ordered Frayne to sit down with her, and Frayne, who did not know how to be helped any more than Halloran did, went in swinging. "I don't need a head doctor," she said. "I need to be left alone." "You need both," Morrison said mildly. She was a spare, unhurried woman who had heard every version of this and was not moved by any of them. "And you can have the second after you've had the first. Sergeant, you didn't break out there on that ridge. You bent under a load that would have snapped anyone I've ever treated. And you're still standing, which tells me more about you than any range record. But you've been treating your own life as the least valuable thing on the ledger. And that's not humility. That's a slow way of quitting." Frayne said nothing. "Whose voice is it?" Morrison asked. "That tells you that you have to be perfect?" And that was the crack that let the water out. Because it was her grandmother's voice, and it wasn't. It was the voice of a girl who had been the only good rifle shot in a family that couldn't afford to admire a girl for it, who had learned that the single thing that turned her strangeness into worth was that she did not miss, and who had built her whole self on that one narrow beam and then walked it out over a canyon. Frayne talked, in that spare office, more than she had talked in years, about the trapline, and the old woman with the ruined hands who had made her promise to use what she'd been given and not waste it, and how somewhere along the way a promise had turned into a debt, and the debt had turned into a cell. She cried, which she hated, and Morrison let her, which she hated less than she expected. What turned it in the end was not the therapy, though the therapy was the frame that held the turning. It was the team. Because when Frayne came out of that office wrung dry and certain she'd been marked as broken, She found them waiting. Halloran and Pike and Ostrander and the medic Reyes and Cho. Not by accident, all of them, in the cramped rec room, and Reyes handed her a coffee and said, "We heard you had a rough one," and that was all. And it undid her worse than Morrison had. "I almost killed that boy," she told them, because she needed at least one place in the world where she said the true thing out loud. "You almost saved him, and did save him," Pike said. "Both. That's the whole job. You don't get the one without the risk of the other. Nobody in this room gets to pretend otherwise." He set his own coffee down. "You want to know why we're here, Frayne? It's not because you're the best shot any of us has ever seen, though you are. It's because you called a win that saved every man in this room when you had nothing to gain by being right, and everything to lose by being wrong. You spent yourself on us before you even knew our names. So we're going to spend some back. That's not charity. That's the deal. That's what a team is, when it's the real thing and not just a word on an org chart." And one by one they told her Ostrander, in 3 gruff words, Cho in a joke that wasn't really a joke, Reyes with a hand on her shoulder, that she was not a rifle they had been issued. She was one of them. It is a strange alchemy, the narrator might note, that turns hard and frightened men into something gentle for exactly as long as gentleness is required, and then lets them go back to being what they were. But it is real, and it has saved more soldiers than any medal, and it saved Frayne that night, in a cinder block room that smelled of burnt coffee and gun oil, surrounded by people who had decided her life was worth as much as her aim. She took the month Halloran ordered her to take. She left the rifle behind on purpose, in its case in the arms room, because she knew that if she brought it, she'd practice. And practicing was just fear wearing a work shirt. She flew home to the long gray country north of the mountains, and she stood at her grandmother's grave in a wind that smelled of snow and told the old woman everything. The 19 dead man on the ridge, the boy in the schoolyard, the half-second the wind hooked, the way she had nearly let a promise finish the job the enemy couldn't. She half expected the wind to have an answer. It didn't. It was only wind. But standing in it, she understood, finally, what the old woman had actually meant by "don't waste it." And it was not what the girl had heard. The old woman had not meant be perfect or die trying. She had meant don't waste the whole of yourself on the one narrow thing you're good at. The gift had always been the seeing, and the seeing was for living, not only for killing, and a person who used it only to fold lives up inside a bullet was wasting most of what she'd been given. She came back after the month with weight back on her frame and the gray gone from under her eyes, and she walked into the ops shack and found Halloran and said, "Permission to rejoin the team, Master Sergeant." "Granted." He looked at her a long moment. "You look like a person again. Working on it." A small, real smile. "New rules, though. I keep talking to Morrison. I get a veto on any op where the arithmetic's a child in the open and my hands are the only vote. And when it goes wrong, because it will, one day it will, I don't get to carry it alone. You take a corner of it. All of you do. That's the deal," Pike says. She put out her hand. "That's the deal." Halloran took it. "That's the deal." They ran 100 more missions, or something like 100, and she did not miss the ones that mattered, and once or twice she missed ones that didn't, and let herself, on purpose, feel nothing much about it, which was its own kind of hard-won marksmanship. She read the wind off snowfields and river valleys and city rooftops, and she talked frightened teams around buried killing grounds, and she taught Pike and Ostrander, and even, eventually, a new rookie of her own to undecide what they were looking at and see the thing that was actually there. She learned to sleep. She learned that being needed and being valued could, with work and with the right people, be made to overlap. A year on, she sat with Halloran on a ridge above a valley whose name she had bothered to learn, watching the light go down the couloirs the way meltwater finds a drain, and he asked her whether she ever regretted staying in a job that had nearly broken her. Frayne watched the wind move the grass for a while before she answered. "Some nights," she said, "and then I think about the boy and the nurse and every man in this outfit who's going home to somebody because I called a thing right when nobody else could see it. My grandmother used to say a gift you won't spend on anybody, but yourself isn't a gift, it's a hoard, and hoards rot." She was quiet a moment. "I spent it. I nearly spent all of me with it, and that was the mistake, and I fixed the mistake, but I don't regret the spending. Only the part where I forgot I was worth keeping too." Halloran nodded slowly. Below them the valley filled up with blue shadow, and the first stars came out cold and indifferent over a country that would, tomorrow, need something impossible from her again. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was only the wind, telling its long, true story to the one person on the ridge who had ever learned how to listen and who had finally, after everything, decided she was part of the story worth saving.